Okay, first of all, so let me welcome everybody to this month's History Political Thought seminar. Today we're featuring the work of Michelle Schwarze. Welcome, Michelle. Thanks for joining us. Michelle is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her work focuses on moral psychology and the history of political economy, especially in the 18th century moral and political theory and in the moral, economic, and political thought of Adam Smith. Her most recent book, very good book, called Recognizing Resentment, highly recommend it. Take a look. And today she is going to talk to us about Locke and Rousseau. Michelle.
Great. So I thank you. First, thank you all for coming. And Jeff, thanks for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to getting to discuss this paper with everyone today. I am taking my cue from the information that was provided to me about the nature of the workshop. So I'm not going to, do any lecturing about it or sort of summarize the main points, assuming you read it. Instead, I'll just try to situate it a little bit by giving you a bit of background on the origin of the paper and then sort of where we are with it or where we've gone. So it's a co-authored paper with a graduate student, here a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin. And it started as a paper that the student Tim Tennyson had in my class on Rousseau on education, which primarily focuses on, but we also read Locke's Some Thoughts. We read some selections from Smith. We read sort of other pieces from Rousseau to contextualize it. And he was really interested in the love of dominion that Locke talked about as sort of one of the key things to curb in his educational model, right? The two natural propensities, the love of dominion and love of liberty, and education is being directed at fixing love of dominion in many ways. And so after the semester concluded, we talked a little bit more about that and really the role that it played in something like what you might call Locke's character education and his focus on honesty in particular, which really seemed to matter a lot for Locke's, for Locke, I should say. And we kind of both noted that Rousseau had Rousseau's criticisms of Locke in Emile, especially in book 2, seem to be suggesting that Locke is, aside from whether or not he disagrees with Locke's ends, that Locke seems to be failing on his own kind of grounds. He's not able to inculcate the honesty that he wants to in children, as well as to do things like cultivate freedom or kind of autonomy, which Jonathan Marks has sort of written really nicely about already, and instead shows that Locke's method counterproductively actually awakens dishonesty, incentivizes lying in children, and does the opposite of what he was trying to do. So we decided we would try to put together a piece on this that, again, I thought we saw as kind of complementary to what Jonathan Marks did in his piece on Rousseau and Locke and freedom from 2012, but focus instead on the limits of a kind of character education, or specifically for Locke and achieving this kind of honesty he's interested in. So we wrote up this draft, prepared it, and presented it just recently at the virtual APSA in 2021. And had a really good sort of panel with, Lucas Swain and Eric McGilvray, and got very good feedback on the paper as it was written. But that feedback kind of broadly focused on two criticisms. The paper, as we presented it for APSA, more broadly framed the issue in terms of the limitations of contemporary liberal educational models interested in autonomy, and said that sort of we can look back to Locke, who has a kind of familiar story about how to educate children for autonomy, and see where this is wrong via Rousseau's Critique. And we basically got what I think was kind of reasonable pushback on two fronts. The first was that we didn't need to really turn to Locke to make that criticism of contemporary educational models, or to point out the limitations of contemporary educational models for autonomy, that Locke was sort of ill to do that. And it looked like, we kind of had a hammer and then we were looking for a contemporary problem to serve as a nail. So we got that criticism. And then we got quite a bit of pushback on this idea that Locke should be properly deemed a liberal thinker, or is valuable. It's valuable to him as recognizably liberal, in the same way that sort of contemporary educational debates within the liberal tradition are playing out now. And so we took that kind of feedback in stride and decided we would revise and try to reframe the paper, kind of cut that reframe the paper context of a contemporary character education within liberal societies, but I think still felt pretty uncomfortable, satisfied with our answer to the first criticism that we got, what I kind of counted as the first criticism that we got from those APSA panels, namely that, again, is Locke really, do we really want to talk about the limits of sort of a liberal education in character in the contemporary literature, or are we sort of interested in the limits of Locke and his educational theory, and that we don't need to necessarily talk about the first to talk about the second? So we revised again and sort of cut that frame one more time and narrowed it to the version that you all read for the workshop today. And that really is a much more narrow frame where we try to say Locke's pedagogy is directed at two things: creating sort of individuals who are capable of rational consent, of individual thought, and then also the kind of self-government that he elaborates in, or the model of self-government that he elaborates in the second treatise and elsewhere. And so we're now kind of in the process of trying to revise the paper further for submission with this new narrow frame, but I'm broadly interested in everyone's questions and feedback on the paper. I would be particularly interested in your kind of reactions to a few things, namely, first, does that narrow frame kind of lessen the appeal, or did you find that the paper was sort of too framed as it was, kind of too in the weeds about the discussion between Locke and Rousseau? And then two, kind of related to that, is the paper successfully or sufficiently, I should say, motivated? I think I worry a lot, to borrow a phrase from our political science colleagues, that we don't really answer the so what question sufficiently to make this paper of interest to people who are not just Locke or Rousseau scholars. So I'm interested in that. And then more practically, if you don't think either of those are a problem, or if you're satisfied sort of with the frame and do think that it's that it has reasonable appeal beyond kind of a limited audience, and I would love to hear thoughts also on appropriate venues to send it to, aside from all of your sort of questions and criticisms. So I think I'll stop there. I don't have much else to summarize, and let you take over with questions, Jeff.
Good. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So if you have a question you want to just write, I have a question in the chat. I mean, as I say that already, or you can raise your hand like Rita did. That's fine, or Michael did. Okay, Aline, I saw you first, and then Rita, and then Michael.
Okay, so thank you so much. It was really interesting, and especially it's like I'm committed because I have like 3 kids. Well, they are grown ups now, but it's too late. But I have 3 kids and 1 granddaughter, so now I have some hopes for the granddaughter in terms of education. Kidding. I do have, since you raised the technical thing, I think for the paper to be better, it would be very nice if at the beginning, in the introduction, you would mention what will be the next like 3 parts and so on and so forth, so the reader knows what to expect, basically. But this is just a technical problem. Now, a more kind of like serious problem is I have a doubt about what hypocritical means and what nature means in Rousseau, and accordingly to the paper, you agree with Rousseau on that, like there are no questions what human nature is, because I still have a kind of like a question here. So what is the difference between the apparent and the actual self that you are mentioning repeatedly? What is the true character? You go against habituation, although at some point you kind of save it, saying that there are good and bad habituations, and Rousseau also save it, with no mentions to Aristotle, for example, that habit is part of education, and also that it's kind of like becomes a second nature, speaking about nature, because again, I don't know how to frame this, but for me, the point of human beings is that they don't have a nature.
Mhm.
They can be educated one way or another. So to assume that, like Rousseau does, and I respectfully disagree with Rousseau. I know I'm pissing Jeff off, but anyway, I respectfully disagree. What is human nature? The human nature is that's the whole point. There is no human nature. It can go either way. And by the way, that's Rousseau's point after all. He says it's liberty, right? You can go one way or another. So how can you assume that when you say it's unnatural? What do you mean by unnatural? Also about, there is no mention throughout the whole paper about different ages. There are kids, children. It's like, okay, 5 years old, 5 months old is not the same with a 2 years old, 3 years old, or 7 years old. At some point, there are some mentions about the 7 years old boy or something like that. But I mean, it's a huge difference in terms of how a kid can understand or not what's reasonable or not. So, well, again, and so this boils down. Okay, let me. I know I already talked too much, but what is hypocrisy when you talk about human nature? Am I pretending now something or not? When I wear a tie when I'm lecturing, believe it or not, I do. Am I a hypocrite or not? When you respect some conventions every now and then, are you a hypocrite or you are not? So the whole paper stands on what is hypocrisy after all when it comes to human nature. If I say, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, thank you. Am I a hypocrite or not? I still don't have an answer to these questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Celine. I appreciate those. So I'll take sort of 3 things. First, really easily, I think you're right. I noticed in rereading this draft that I must have gotten happy with my cutting material and deleted the previous roadmap and didn't introduce a new one. So obviously that needs to go on page 2 to sort of summarize what we're doing in the paper. And that's a pretty easy thing to add. Second, the last point about, or the second to last point about childhood and sort of, what period of childhood are we talking about here? Rousseau is pretty explicit in Emile that book 2 is sort of covering childhood up until the age of maturity or adolescence, which he thinks is around kind of 12, and it's past the age of infancy, which is what book 1 is about. So I think for both him and Locke, this age of childhood is something like 5 to 12. Before, for Rousseau, some of the kinds of more problematic passions are awakened, especially eros. And when
May I
yeah.
interrupt just for a second?
Oh yeah, of course.
In the paper, there is a mentioning about people before they start talking. So it's not about between 5 and whatever. It's way before 5, according to the paper. I don't know. Again, I'm no specialist.
Well, I will double check that. I wonder if it's because of Rousseau's sort of insistence in book 2 that if you're raising children right, they're actually not going to be using much language, because part of the reason that we reward the use of language in children is because we like them to perform things they don't understand, right? They don't have the use of kind of developed reason that he'll talk about in book 3 and later in Emile. In any event, I think we can that in the paper and clarify that. The bigger question that you're asking, I think, is an important one. And I also noticed in rereading this, which is really, so what is the difference between a parent and actual self, which is the basis for kind of hypocrisy, or what is the difference between, we don't really use this term, or I notice we just introduce amour-propre and we don't really talk about how amour-propre is different from amour de soi, which is really the crux of what's happening here, right? The crux of Rousseau's argument is that by not realizing that you're appealing to a child's interest and linking that interest to deception and lies rather than to truth, as we do when we tell them fables and teach them the wrong story, right? Or as we do when we try to use praise and blame in the way that Locke suggests to get them to follow our interests, or to get them to follow what looks like a moral scheme, but one that they can't understand. We're setting up this difference we discuss this between appearance and reality in the paper, but we then don't link that to why that sets the child or the person against themselves. So
sorry
yes.
Again for interrupting, but that's my big core question. What is the difference between appearance and reality when it comes to the self? And what is hypocrisy when it comes to self? I'm not talking now, I'm pretending to be, I don't know, a fight pilot or whatever, or whatever, something which is obvious. I'm talking about, how am I perceiving myself? Am I lying to myself when I say, oh, I want to, I don't know, help the poor and give money to the homeless or whatever? Am I lying to myself? Am I lying to myself when I'm dressing in a certain way for a job interview or not? What does it mean, hypocrisy, when it comes to human nature? What means hypocrisy when it comes to kids, when they say they know how to behave, like you should not yell or whatever, disturb the people when you go to McDonald's, let's say. Is it hypocrisy or it's human nature? I mean, for me, this is the core question that the paper does not address, and I'm stopping here.
Okay, yeah, no more follow-ups. That's my rule. Okay.
I appreciate you pushing it, Aline, because I think, like I said, I think you're right. I think that I'll clarify what we mean by hypocrisy or lying to yourself. I don't think Rousseau thinks children are really capable, right, in the sense that he thinks children resemble natural human beings, and he makes a lot of that in Emile, in that they're good for themselves. They're able to meet kind of their limited interests, but they're dependent on others. They don't have an implicit, as Locke suggests, sort of intention to dominate others, a love of dominion that might make them try to exercise their wills over other people and other things. Instead, they just sort of have basic needs they need met, but they're independent, and they try to be good for themselves with as little harm done to us as possible, right? So sort of a combination of amour de soi and something like pity, modifying their behavior. The trouble is when adults, following kind of the Lockean model, try to teach morals to children and reward them for honest behavior, right? they tell them that it's good to do one thing and say another, or good to say one thing and do another. So that sense of hypocrisy. So they don't actually teach them that it's good to lie to themselves so much as they do that it's in their interest. And Rousseau, right, the whole idea of the an education of necessity and the sensory education of Emile being about guiding our immediate interest, which is all he thinks children are capable of really understanding, that we're not capable of lying to ourselves so much as we are seeing that it's in our interest to lie to others, right? And once we do that, Rousseau thinks, as in the case of the fable that he kind of hilariously, right, evaluates, The Crow and the Fox, which is this reference to Reynard the Fox and also to Aesop's, it's from La Fontaine, but it's obviously a fable from Aesop's fables that Locke refers to as well, that we get, children interpret those fables differently. They see whose interests are met and whose aren't. And what the difference between, the important split there is the difference between appearance and reality. And so I think you're totally right to suggest that we need to that out much more in the paper. We need to bring out much more what amour propre is, how it's distinct from amour de soi, and then exactly how this is connected to, right, to Rousseau's criticism, because that's what he means by becoming hypocritical, right, in that sense. Seeing the advantage of doing one thing and saying another, of being dishonest, and of, I mean, the sort of more mental problem for Rousseau, right? The idea that you set up this cleavage between, right, your true self, or your what your immediate interests are, what amour de soi is, and what sort of the interests of amour propre are. And those things become irreconcilable. Those things become irreconcilable in civil society in a really problematic way for him. Right.
A man divided against himself. I'm stopping now, Jeff. Promise.
Good. You're in trouble otherwise. All right, Rita, I think you're up.
Okay, well, I'm not going to ask you anything so fundamental as whether humans can be hypocritical, or whether there is a human nature. Although I'm going to ask you something like that about Locke, which is, where do you think that Locke thinks that this desire for dominion comes from? Because it sounds from your paper like you're arguing that that he thinks it's just spontaneous in all children. It's just like a kind of inherent human nature. And I'm not really sure that that's how he presents it. And it seems like he might actually be somewhat closer to Rousseau in his presentation. I mean, all he says about it is that it shows itself very early, almost as soon as children are born. And so it doesn't seem to like be born with us. But it is kind of a question where it comes from. And then my second question is, I mean, I think you're broadly right. Like, this is also what I argue in my book, that Rousseau is critiquing Locke's education for being hypocritical or being self-contradictory, not delivering on its promises. And one of those things is this education by authority that substitutes for what Rousseau does, which is education by necessity or nature. But what do you think is the purpose of Rousseau's critique? What is he trying to get out of Locke? Because he offers this alternative. I mean, the way he does the critique is by showing Emile's education, which is the sort of working out of the contradictions that he sees in Locke. But the result is an education that is crazy and impossible, right? Yeah. And so what is he trying to do in making this critique? Is he trying to just show that Locke is hypocritical or contradictory? Is he trying to advance an alternative account of pedagogy that is supposed to be replicable in some way or usable? Or is he trying to do something else entirely? Because I think that, I mean, with respect to the first question you asked in your presentation, how to frame it, maybe trying to get at Rousseau's purpose is one way of framing it more broadly than what you have here, without trying to get into, you know, contemporary debates or try to relate this to contemporary pedagogy.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Rita. So I'll say on the first, I mean, I was just looking in in some thoughts for this, but he says the love of dominion and love of liberty are sort of two instinctive principles in Locke. This is Locke, I'm sorry, in children, in human beings, and that they can produce different kinds of desires. One, right, liberty seems to be this desire to like do what we want, understood kind of as license, right, in that book. And then dominion can either be to dominion over people or dominion in things, and the latter Locke doesn't seem to have such an issue with, especially unsurprising if you think about, right, the defense of property. But he, you know, all this stuff in some thoughts about distinguishing between wants of nature and wants of fancy, this idea that really what's problematic is encouraging in children this desire to dominate other people rather than stomping it out when you first see it. And the reason that I see that as instinctive for Locke in a way that Rousseau seems to suggest it's not in the criticism in Emile is that he thinks those are, if you think about how you deal with a recalcitrant child in these ways, right? First, you try to get them to be honest or say the right thing. If they don't do that, you try to suggest it's horrible, call it like you act as though they've done a monstrous thing, right? If they continue to lie or resist authority, then eventually you sort of beat them and insist on authority. But it doesn't seem like that's awakened, or that, to put this a little bit differently, it doesn't seem like there's anything that you could have done to prevent that love of dominion and its manifestation, so much as Locke is interested in curbing it, whereas part of, as you kind of suggested, right, part of Rousseau's crazy natural educational model, to the extent that we think that's an actual education model, or right, Emile's education is the one that we're supposed to be most interested in Emile, that has a very different kind of insistence on what childhood is and the innocence of childhood, right? That doesn't include a kind of dominion, because children, again, kind of like natural men, and there are all of these comparisons in Emile to the social, to this discourse, excuse me, and the notion of, right, childhood kind of being like, in really interesting and complicated ways, like a state of nature, right? I think Denise Schaefer's book is really good on this, for pointing out the ways that might then complicate the idea that natural men are actually independent or self-sufficient or solitary in the way that Rousseau suggests in the second discourse. But in any way, so he's trying to suggest that love of dominion is most definitely not there. It's just an interest in meeting physical needs, right, that children have. And we only inspire a sort of pernicious love of dominion in them once they've been served, right, is the language. Once they realize that they can get other people to submit to their will, and to be sort of means to their ends, rather than just people who might be beneficent or help them with their physical needs, who might or who might not, right? He wants to emphasize that too. So I do think that there's a difference, at least in Locke's text, when he introduces the love of dominion as natural, though I will definitely go back and make sure I'm not reading things into that I shouldn't be. As for the second question, and I really appreciate your invitation to think about how an answer to that might provide a better frame or broader frame for the project. I think I don't know what I'll say on this, other than I think it's really difficult to figure out exactly what Rousseau is doing in Emile. And I'm not exactly sure, as John Scott, and again, even Denise Schaefer and others who've commented or interpreted Emile have suggested that it's just an education for Emile, right? Or that either the models that we get in Emile are solely for a natural education, or that the audience that he has in mind is solely one interested in raising a child like Emile, who ends up looking very bizarre right at the end of book 5. And then if you interpret the success or failure of the book through the lens of what happens in Emile et Sophie, then it's even worse, right? But I'll just say, right, there are constant references even throughout the, I think we talk about a few of these in the paper, and there are references in the first two books, Emile, to many different children who are not Emile, right? And many different tutors who are possibly Rousseau or aren't Rousseau. And almost all of those examples are of civilized children, often of corrupted children. And so the education that is given to them might actually be something more along the lines of what we would consider Locke's education is, right? Explicitly an education for civilized, in his case, gentlemen, right? That he's trying to bring up to be able to rationally consent. So that is just to say, to more explicitly answer your question, I think that it can be true that Rousseau is offering a criticism of Locke on Locke failing on his own terms, which is what we're suggesting. And that we can say that without trying to weigh in on whether or not he promotes an alternative and whether or not we think that alternative is preferable to the one that Locke proposes. We're really trying to, maybe it's not, maybe then we face the problem of, as I started the seminar by saying we face the problem that's too narrow of a point to make, but I think it's valuable to think through why Locke might fail on his own grounds without considering the much more challenging question of whether or not Rousseau's crazy natural education is preferable, achievable, or any of those other kinds of things that you suggested.
Well, I mean, one reason I raised this is because, I mean, it seems like you could say he's critiquing Locke philosophically, but not critiquing him practically, right? And that has a very different kind of payoff, which is that he may be still endorsing Lockean education as like a thing you can do. But showing us Rousseauian education, Emile's education as, if you really want to be philosophically consistent, this is what you'd have to do. Like, if you want to understand how human beings work, this is what is required to understand it fully. But the reality of social life is that there are compromises. And so the result might still be Lockean as a practical matter.
So I like that very much, because I've always tried to figure out, obviously it also makes me think of how you interpret the social contract, right? And what the purpose of the sort of principles of political right are versus his practical political education. But, he has this reference that I noticed more in teaching the text. Rousseau has this reference to the masterpiece of a good education as being to make a reasonable man on page 89 of Emile in book 2. So he does seem to be, in classic Rousseauian way, he does seem to be suggesting, right, that that one goal, that if you do want to make a reasonable man, and that is the kind of education that might be achievable in society which we live in civilized society which we are going to be in, and which we might even think for certain reasons Rousseau thinks is preferable to, right, natural state and all this, that it's important to evaluate Locke's education on its own terms for that reason, because it's not as though he's averse to that educational goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see that kind of broadly in his project, right? Which is that he's a kind of anti-liberal liberal, right? And he does this with Locke and Hobbes on every question, on the social contract, on the state of nature, right? Like, here's what really the state of nature would have had to look like if we follow your premises. But in the end, like, I'm willing to have the same conclusion as you.
Right, that's it. Or, you get this most where students often miss this when you read the second discourse for the first time, and it's just an inevitable downfall, right? Even though he insists on how accidental it is the whole time, and forget that actually the best state for man is the golden mean society in which amour propre has already been awakened. People are social, there's love, like conjugal and familial love. It's not the state of nature. It's not what Voltaire suggested, right? And so I think that kind of intuition is true about his education, but I really appreciate the invitation to bring that out a little bit more and explain what we're doing. So thank you.
Michael Gillespie.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you for the paper. Just FYI, I've been working on Locke for the last 3 years, so this is something of deep interest to me at the moment. Number one, I'm kind of astounded that people pay so much attention to Locke and Rousseau on education, since neither one of them ever really raised children. Their views.
The Earl of Shaftesbury, Michael.
Yeah. Well, let me finish. that Locke actually knew children, right? Rousseau gave all, if we believe what he says in the Confessions, gave all of his children away, not wanting to educate them. And in addition to the fact that that Locke is talking about parents educating children, and Rousseau is talking about a tutor educating children, which removes the whole question of the role love plays in education, especially in very small children. So that's my first remark. Second remark, I wonder if you've looked at the letters to the Clarks from Locke. Those seem to me to be very important because those were the basis for thoughts on education, and he's thinking specifically in those instances about the Clarks' children. So so some of his and about the Clarks. So some of it is tailored to that. I think that's important. I think the crucial issue in this thing is it's not. I think hypocrisy plays a role, but I really think it turns on the question of original sin and libido dominandi. And Rousseau's attributing that to Locke, and you said almost something like that when you said it's instinctual for Locke at one time, and then the other time you said it just seems to appear very early. Well, for Locke, it's not. He really rejects the whole notion of original sin, and he attributes that desire in human beings to the fact that we are passionate beings who have needs, who have to support ourselves. And invariably, when we're young, we don't know how to do that. So we're demanding. We want things. We're hungry. We're angry. I mean, anybody that's raised children can tell you about what happens when you're trying to raise children. They're angry. They're hungry. They need their diaper changed. They're lonely, and they want your love. And that's something that neither one of Locke nor Rousseau really talked very much about. This, the fear young children have of being deprived of their parents' love. And that's one. Now, so our children naturally, you say at one point, Rousseau demonstrates that Locke contradicts himself. Well, that's true if you accept Rousseau's theory that children are naturally innocent, and that they, and that just seems to me problematic. So I would certainly be a little bit more careful about that claim that you're making there. And I think that children are, some children are dishonest on some occasions, but I don't think that they're dishonest because they hope to get something from you by being dishonest. I think they're most often dishonest because they don't want to admit that they've done something that you would consider wrong. And they usually we know that sociopaths develop about age 3, right? Because they don't somehow internalize the fact that they have some parental standard to live up to. So, I think in that sense, most kids do that. And so anyway, with respect to the whole argument in your questions, I think I would say right now you make one point, and I would consider it to be a point that really is appropriate either for Locke scholars or Rousseau scholars, probably more for Locke scholars than Rousseau scholars. And that means it probably is fit to appear in a more specialist journal. I don't think it would be a big enough question for political theory, for example. It certainly wouldn't be a big enough question for JOP or APSR or something like. I mean, you need to, and that's why I think you would have to add on the question that Rita raised, like what is what's the payoff? What's the big thing that we take away from this, in addition to the fact that there's this dispute between Locke and Rousseau. So if I were reading it, I'd want to see a lot of these things clarified. And then I'd want to know, okay, so why should I be interested in this, right? I'm interested in it because I'm working on Locke right now. But assuming I wasn't working on Locke right now, why in the world would I want to read this paper?
Right. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Thank you, Michael, for taking the time with it, and also for the comments. Like I said, that was my main concern in rereading it, is that I do think by gutting it of what I thought were kind of inappropriate or anachronistic kind of attempts to connect it to the contemporary literature on education, whether character education or education for autonomy in liberal education, that it didn't fit right, and that, you know, so we cut that, but we didn't really replace it with anything. And I think the point that Rita just suggested is a nice one to explore, about how we might widen the frame and hopefully broaden the appeal. But as it stands, I take your point. The point about your first comment, that it's always funny, we pay attention to who didn't, their thoughts on education, who didn't have children. John Scott say that the thing that the best thing Rousseau ever did for his 5 kids was drop at the orphanage. And I feel like reading this book gives you that sense. But I mean, I take that point. I think it's valuable so far as they both argue for this as their respective educational models, or perhaps in Rousseau's case, the various kinds of educational models he proposes as being necessary for creating men or citizens, right, for realizing the kinds of people who are going to provide the meat for his political theory, so to speak. The point about the letters to the Clarks, I actually have not explored that, and we've obviously evaluated the original dedicatory letter to Edward Clarke, but haven't looked at those. So I appreciate that. We will as we revise it. And then the last kind of point about the big point about original sin, and we say in the paper, right, we admit that Locke is not in favor, like rejects the Augustinian doctrine of original sin for sort of a blank slate, but how you can say that and also say he wants to admit that there's something like a natural love of dominion. I realize we're on rocky ground there. So I think it's worth trying to be more precise in our language. I'll just say your examples of why children are, of how children react, right? And the thing they kind of do. I have a 2-year-old, so reading Emile, and especially reading all this section, really smacks true to me, where she's now in the stage of life where she's learned that she can say things to get a rise out of you, or she'll try to lie and see what happens after you've seen her do something, and she'll say she did the opposite, just because they want to test their boundaries and see whether there's praise or reward happens along with it, because they think these things are fun too. So I do think that Rousseau, in his framework, thinks that children are naturally innocent, but I think maybe what's missing from our paper, and that those examples of children sort of misbehaving are consistent with that. What's missing in the paper is an explanation of natural innocence is for Rousseau, just like we don't really talk about, right, what self-love is, or what amour de soi is in contrast to amour propre. We also really don't explain, related to amour de soi, what natural goodness is, or the ways in which a child might be able to be innocent, right, or good for themselves, which is what they might do bad things and then tell you about them, or what we consider conventionally to be bad things. But Rousseau's point is that those conventions are out of step with kind of a more natural morality, or with their ability to meet their limited needs, and that they fundamentally can't understand duties to other people, the kind of more at the larger system of morality that adults construct until far off. And so if we try to introduce that to them in advance, we just show them that there's a difference between their actual interest and what morality says, right? So we teach them the value of being dishonest, or we teach them the value of vice, is what he's suggesting. But I very much take your point that I think it's hard for us to make that claim without explaining, right, what amour de soi is, why, what an innocent love of self is for Rousseau, why children have that, and then in what way they can be naturally innocent that would be consistent with children being good in the moral sense, that we use that term in terms of conventional morality, right?
One question, just a little short remark. One question you might ask is whether children could survive if all they had was amour de soi, which is to say, if they weren't demanding and didn't want stuff from their parents who are always overburdened, whether or not they would survive. I mean, that just seems to me to be one of Locke's fundamental questions, and something that Rousseau just imagines will take place.
Right. Well, I think interestingly enough, at least Rousseau wants to make the claim in Emile that is consistent, that they do have amour de soi and they can still be somewhat dependent. And I think that's a really, I'll just admit that I don't understand how to evaluate that claim. You get the model of the pure state of nature that you get from the second discourse, right, and elsewhere, which seems to be the insistence on self-sufficiency. And it's blatant, right, that children are not self-sufficient. They can be. So I don't know how to reconcile those two things yet, I guess. But thank you.
Dan, you're up.
Okay, so thank you for sharing the paper with us. It's funny that I'm seeing you and Rick and Holly here when we often meet in our own virtual room. So I got two kind of quick comments and three suggestions / questions. The first comment echoes what Rita wrote in the chat and what Michael mentioned about Locke's work as a tutor and the letters he wrote about this. So if Emily Nakel's got a really good piece on this, though I don't know if it's published yet, but she actually argues that Locke he's listening to parents and he's actually observing children, which Rousseau would never do. The second one is just in terms of terminology. Sometimes you'll use the term autonomy, sometimes you'll use self-government, sometimes you'll say, there's one place where you say self-government or autonomy or vice versa. Sometimes you'll talk about independent thought or reason or rationality. And I think it would be good to just be consistent in usage, especially because, I mean, I couldn't find any instances of autonomy anywhere in at least the Liberty Fund online Library of Liberty Locke editions, could be elsewhere. And same with liberal. I think on page 16, you use the term liberal. I think there, I mean, if it's like liberal education, it makes sense. And like the, classic, like early modern sense of it. But just kind of terminological stuff. Questions. First is, why does Locke think dishonesty is so bad anyway? I mean, I don't advocate lying, but it just wasn't clear to me quite why he's so worried about dishonesty, whereas it was very clear to me why Rousseau was worried about hypocrisy. So that's just to say that I thought you and Tim did a better job, not better, but a more complete job of articulating the hypocrisy reasoning than the dishonesty reasoning. The second point echoes what Aline remarked and some others did too. Even if it's the case that you're not writing this to hold that Rousseau is better in some sense or more desirable or more coherent, that was just the sense that I got as a reader. So for example, that his worries about hypocrisy seem far more weighty than some things we find in Locke, for example. And so I was wondering if, and it sounds like you don't think so, but I was wondering if the thrust of the paper is to basically say that Rousseau is right about these things, at a minimum, the logical contradiction within Locke, right? Or does it even go further that Rousseau is write about hypocrisy, right? I mean, I personally don't think so. I mean, I'm a Mandeville fan. I don't think we could exist as a civilization without, salutary deception. But that last question then leads into, you asked a bit about framing and outlets. And I mean, I can think of, depending on how that last question is answered, I can think of 3 different ways you could sort of frame the P4, right? So one would just be kind of, an aim at a journal like maybe 18th century studies, right? This is just reconstructing the ins and outs of Rousseau's critique of Locke, and why, in fact, this might tell us that there's a sort of structural weakness in Locke's argument, an inconsistency, or that the outcome can't be attained by the means, or something like that. A different model would be you reconstruct Rousseau's critique, and then you rescue Locke, right? Does he maybe in the letters, for example, maybe Locke isn't as harebrained as he seems about this. Maybe he's actually thought a lot more about this, and if we have a fuller account of his writings about education, maybe we lose some of these concerns, or maybe not, right? But I mean, that would be a model, is sort of rescuing Locke. Another would just be to say, Rousseau nailed it. We're all going to raise our kids with a meal, which I find terrifying. Like I said, I think hypocrisy is important. But that's another model, but that's not the one I think you want to have. And then the third one would just be, okay, so well, why turn to Locke at all? Presumably, I mean, one answer could be, and I don't know the literature, maybe in literature on civic education, people like Locke a lot. Okay, so well, the problem that these thinkers are running into, and like civic education theorists, where it's hard to imagine how we could have an education for autonomy in any strong sense, because they're little people. Like Aline brings out a little person as a prop as we're doing this, and they stand in need of authority, right? So how could we have autonomy in any strict sense if that's the case? Well, so one model might be, well, we're tracing this fundamental difficulty to Locke, and we're seeing it through Rousseau. Again, I don't even know if that's what's going on in the literature, but it seems to me that bigger intervention wise would be either like rescue Locke from Rousseau, which maybe you don't want to do, or maybe you do, or that the turn to Locke is that he plays an unacknowledged or maybe acknowledged role in lots of contemporary writers on civic education that are they're all spinning their wheels, and the reason why is that it's this fundamental thing that goes back to Locke. So depending on, I think, the framing and whether any of those, I mean, there's other models, there's a couple that it could take, just a straight up Locke Rousseau paper. I mean, that could be history of political thought. That could go to 18th century journal, or what is it? Modern European intellectual history is another. I mean, if there is something in the education literature, there's like educational theory, there's education history quarterly, I know is a pretty good one. Or if it can be more about, people like Stephen Macedo or Amy Gutman or whoever, then it could go to like perspectives on politics, Those are just some thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. So a few things. First, thank you for I didn't know Emily had a paper on Locke as tutor, and how that was sort of a success. So I'll reach out to her if I can't find that. Rousseau did serve as a tutor, by the way, for a while, for I think not Condillac, but like a relative of Condillac's in Lyon, and it went about as good as you would have expected it to go. So yeah, we are, as I'll say, we're not really interested in defending Rousseau's education for a meal, or the supposedly negative natural education and what that wrought, nor defending Rousseau as a tutor, or a parent, all of which would be a disaster. So, but I think, thanks for the reference to Emily's work. The second point on autonomy, I think, and the use of liberal on page 16, some of these are vestiges of the old versions of the paper that are just need to be taken out. Because as I said, the original frame was sort of, where do contemporary, or what's kind of wrong with contemporary education models, liberal educational models for autonomy, what do they do, and sort of what are the limitations, and then using Locke as a lens to show why they might fail, basically. So a different version of one of the larger frames that you gave us. That was the one that we presented at APSA, and like I said, rightfully got some criticisms on, and so we tried to a lot of it of autonomy, but now still have autonomy and self-government in there, and it's sloppy and needs to be fixed. So I appreciate that, those points. The kind of broader suggestions, concerns about the fact that we don't explain or motivate why dishonesty is bad for Locke. And that I think is actually related to your sense, which we explicitly say in like a footnote and in the introduction, we're not trying to say Rousseau is better. We're not vouching for Rousseau. We're simply saying he provides a lens to show why Locke fails on his own standards, which again is very similar to what Jonathan Marks does in this 2012 piece on autonomy, right, in Locke and Rousseau's educational thought. But I think maybe the reason that even though we say that it gives off that sense is that because we don't do the thing that you complained about, right? We don't actually motivate why dishonesty is bad for Locke, whereas we do explain why hypocrisy is so bad for Rousseau. So I wonder maybe if we can address the second point by doing the first. And really what I just to kind of briefly say that, I think the punishments that he sets up to try to correct lying or cheating, those kinds of things, they all have to do with the ability to consent, to agree to things, to be believed, and that kind of trustworthiness that's related to it. So I think one thing that we might be able to do, kill two birds with one stone here, is better explain why dishonesty is bad for him, and also connect that up to how it's related to self-government, which I also think is kind of not as well explained in this current version of the paper as it could be. So, and thank you for the various kinds of suggestions of how we might reframe, as well as what might be good venues to send the revised piece to. I don't think we're trying to rescue Locke. We're also not trying to advocate for Rousseau's model, but we're trying to say there are real kinds of limitations to what Locke is trying to achieve. And Rousseau shows that, right? He's a device to show those limitations, not so we endorse, a natural education where you have everybody running for cake or locking up children in dark rooms to try to teach them how to not be bothersome. So, so I think we would avoid that. I think, like I mentioned at the outset, one of the second frame that we took for the paper after we sort of lopped off the liberal education and autonomy stuff was to turn to the civic education literature, the education and character literature in contemporary kind of educational scholarship, and say, why is it also sort of failing, and to use Locke as a lens for that. I worried, as I said at the outset, that it still had a little bit of this, it still didn't seem very motivated in our choice of Locke, like why use Locke to explain that. Maybe that was just because we didn't motivate the paper as well, but so we'll reconsider that, I guess. And then I saw I'm very bad at looking at the chat at the same time, but I noticed Rita, yes, they do. Rita had a point about whether Locke and Rousseau rely on an understanding of natural necessity to explain how love of dominion should be thwarted. And I think yes, the answer is yes for Rousseau and partially yes for Locke, at least as I read it, that he talks about necessity, but then there are also impositions of authority in the cases when sort of interest is not enough. And then thank you, Michael, for the reference to chat with Ruth about this. We use, I think we cite some of her work, or we did in a previous version, because it's relevant. Thank you, Rick. And also thank you for the point about deception. Sorry, I'm very bad at getting through the chat. I was terrible about that with the whole Zoom teaching thing too.
Mike Hawley.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the paper, and my comment is based on some of the things you just said recently, because I was one of the many who was confused as to whether or not you were sort of endorsing Rousseau. But it does seem to me like if you're using Rousseau to show how Locke's theory fails on its own merits, it does seem like, at least the way you present it, it isn't just that there is an imminent critique to be made of Locke, and Rousseau shows us all what it is. And in fact, if it weren't just as a historical, like a matter of historical record, we could make this case without reference to Rousseau, or Rousseau would just be sort of footnoted somewhere down the bottom. At various points, it seems like Rousseau's Rousseau's critique is not just imminent, it comes from a perspective, and that perspective is relevant to showing why Locke is wrong. So you say things like Rousseau privileges children's natural goodness to keep them ignorant of moral, intellectual, and religious knowledge until their faculties are prepared to receive it. And you sort of reiterate some version of that a couple of other times, where you say things like, the goal of Rousseau's negative education is to keep the child in a state of amoral goodness by only allowing him to develop freely the moral habits, etc. And it seems to me that one could fairly say of Locke that maybe some of the particular tactics that he's using don't quite achieve what he aims at. But this kind of objection seems wildly unfair in light of the fact that nobody is going to be able to raise a child like Emile, which is to say, like, children need to be moralized in general way faster than Rousseau's Emile gets moralized, right? Especially if you have, like, I have two younger brothers, and I'm told that, when I was about 5, I was really ready to kill one of them for knocking over my tower of blocks. And I don't think my mother could wait until I could understand, like, complex moral things before she tried to make me, like, teach me at least externally to obey certain moral rules, because little Matt would have been dead if I didn't learn it. And it seems like this sort of, like, maybe Locke's tactics aren't quite right, but Rousseau's principle that you should wait until the child is ready to internalize these things, which seems like a huge point about what's wrong with what Locke is doing, seems to me unfair, as long as we're worried about the fact that, like, morality isn't just about self-governance. It's about preventing us from killing each other and hitting each other and breaking each other, which children who are surrounded by other children and are, going to cross a street and meet other people are going to, constantly be in danger of doing. And so no matter how exactly the paper is framed, doesn't it seem like Locke might be able to plead something like that in response to this kind of imminent critique? Like, well, maybe I've picked the wrong fables or something like that, but the kids definitely have to know not to hit each other sometime before they, Rousseau would have them learn it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Michael. Thank you. So I think, I think I'm going to have to, but Tim and I are going to have to think a little bit more about that, because I think that's fair. Maybe it isn't just that we're not actually explaining why lying is a bad thing for Locke, but also we're implicitly or maybe explicitly in the sections that you quoted, suggesting that Rousseau is right about childhood innocence, or the ability to keep children in that way, or that we're endorsing his vision of innocence. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. And that Locke would just simply say, well, if you care about harm prevention, in your example, right, and not ensuring children are good for themselves, which might actually entail some harm in Rousseau's model in social environments, then then, this doesn't make any sense, or this isn't a fair criticism. So yeah, I think that's something that I'm just going to have to think a little bit more about. Yeah, I think there's more to, I think there's also something else to be said. And I saw Rita's comment that it is precisely true again for Emile, and insofar as Emile is about suggesting a natural education that creates someone like Emile, that he's not around other people. He's in the country. He's just with his tutor. He's not with other children. So he's not facing those things. Again, all of the examples that you have of how Rousseau inspires honor in children and teaches them generosity by accident, right? As the cake races example in book 2 of Emile, and that's explicitly not Emile as a child. It's a sort of haughty, noble, a child of a noble person who thinks that they can be indolent and lazy and don't actually have to work for goods. And so they want to inspire in them something like a desire for honor and generosity, which really for Rousseau means that they prefer honor and reputation to material goods like the cake reward, essentially. So yeah, that's just to say, to the extent that he's actually endorsing Emile's education or Rousseau, or thinks that it's possible to raise a child like that, that's maybe not a fair standard for Locke. So yeah, I think I just need to think through, as I said, whether or not it's reasonable to still keep that standard of innocence, or how we might think about that in terms of criticizing what Locke is doing. Yeah, sorry, I don't want to call on people. I just saw Dan's hand.
Yeah, well, let me jump in for a second,
Yeah.
Michelle. So I guess one of the questions I had after reading the paper is, what do you think? How do you think Locke would respond to these charges? I mean, one of the interesting things about the paper is that, there's a sort of Rousseau and critique, but I was waiting for the Lockean response, as it were. I mean, is it just that he has just no response at all? I mean, it occurs to me, I mean, just thinking about this, that, I mean, at least one of the responses might appeal to some form of parental authority that Locke discusses in the second treatise, that involves forms of gratitude and love, and forms of trust between children and parents. I mean, so in other words, there might be a different form of authority that could be exercised by parents that would not engender a kind of hypocrisy, or various vices, but because kids actually respect and love their parents, that when they tell them to do things, that they kids trust them, and they so there's the habituation that's involved might not be as pathological as Rousseau suggests. I don't know. I mean, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, we tried to bring out, we don't have, right, like a standalone section that's Locke's reply to the Rousseauian critique or anything like that, that we do try to go through in the second part in like sections B through D, sort of why Rousseau's criticisms aren't exactly fair, or right, the way that he characterizes. Locke's use of fables is not exactly right, because Locke isn't saying read these to them so much as he's saying, like, let them, their diversion, their entertainment, and they might have a moral for children when they're adults. But Rousseau's criticism is still that they actually do teach children a lesson, even if you don't mean them to, right? So that's just to say, we try in the text, as the paper as we go through, to point out where Rousseau's criticisms are maybe a little unfair, or his characterizations. Another classical Rousseau trait, right, to mischaracterize people's positions in service of his own arguments. So, but I think the broader point that you're making about how might Locke respond is a useful one. I think the issue here, and thinking about the authority of parents and the relationship between the use of authority and the development of rationally consenting individuals in some thoughts. You're right about the point in the loving relationship between parents in the second treatise and parental affection. He also says that that's kind of the end goal at in thoughts, it's just not apparent how that happens after you have a parent who doesn't resort to physical punishment except for when they need to insist on obedience. But when they do need to insist on obedience, they do resort to physical punishment. Otherwise, use kind of raise blame in a somewhat heavy-handed way. Just to say, I think that it's a complicated, that Locke's understanding of the authority of parents is kind of complicated. And so how he might respond to that criticism is, yeah, I think you're right. He would want to say that parents build something like trust in a loving relationship with their children. And there are glimmers of that too in terms of how he responds to so in the case of dishonesty, before a child is so disobedient and so resistant to kind of invitations to be honest, that you need to be physically, punish them. He suggests that you want to encourage them and kind of and applaud them for telling they did something wrong if they are honest about it, to reward them. So you promote that kind of bond between parent and child that might therefore become kind of the basis for a loving relationship in adulthood. But I do think that there's some tension there between that model and then the just insistence on obedience and physical violence that goes along with it in his education. Yeah. Right. The one time that he immediately, or the one example he gives of when parents should sort of immediately resort to physical violence is when their authority is just challenged. Like the "you're not the boss of me" sort of critique. The way that you respond to that is with, physical violence, because you just don't want children to doubt authority. Yeah, no, this is good. I mean, I guess I point towards my question is pointing towards a suggestion, take it for what it's worth, but to think about your paper as possibly opening up dialogue between the two rather than taking a stand, right, so over Locke, yeah, right? That you're opening up a dialogue that points out two different alternative models for thinking about civic education and liberalism, right? I mean, because these are recognizably sort of, maybe you could just call them conservative and more liberal or left-leaning approaches to I was just talking about class about approaches to childhood education, its relevance to political theory, and the kids introduced me to the idea of sort of free-range parenting. I mean, this is a sort of Rousseauan heritage. It's clearly sort of more of a model on the left. But in any case, I mean, this could be, I mean, opening up a dialogue, as it were, as thinking about the sort of broader ambit or frame of this paper as a way to sort of touch on, larger questions in contemporary liberalism and its relationship to education, and how the Locke-Rousseau debate could sort of, point towards that. But I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. So Dan.
So it's a quick follow-up to actually Jeff, so I'm planned, but what Jeff said, and then also what Michael had said. I mean, we all probably remember shitty things we did as kids that, thank God, we had authoritarian parents. I mean, come on. So I mean, what's implicit though in Michael's point is that if it's the case, and I will say, I mean, just kind of glancing again at the conclusion, it sounds like the thrust of the argument is that, Rousseau's right about Locke, and that there's certain values that are there in Rousseau's account of education. I'm looking at pages 25 to 26, for example, which would suggest that there's something preferable about Rousseau. And again, I know that's not what you want to argue. But, so again, one model would be like, I mean, I mentioned earlier, rescuing Locke, or as Jeff put it, how would Locke respond, right? And maybe it's not in Thoughts on Education. Maybe it's in the letters. Maybe it's in reasonableness of Christian. I mean, I don't know where it's going to be. Or, again, I mean, I'd be interested. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time with it. I'd be interested to hear why, whether it was because of pushback or just kind of your thinking and Tim's thinking, that you moved away from the more, key problem in liberal, small L liberal education, or key problem in contemporary debates about civic education, which kind of Jeff alluded to, which I think that would be a good frame, right? That in a way, the two of them capture the two poles of thinking, right? Well, whether, like Jeff said, it's liberal or conservative or what have you, but two poles of thinking about how we foster the development of children. And it could be you're tracing the debate to these two, that we're having the same debate, we're spinning our wheels because, maybe like Aline's point, it gets to this kind of black box of human nature, or something along those lines, because the feel of it now is it's more of a Rousseau paper than a Locke paper, given, again, even though, you're not setting out to sort of prefer Rousseau to Locke, it just has that feel to me. And again, there's multiple drafts and iterations going on. That's not a criticism, but to say, I kind of like the model that Jeff put forth, either that there's something central here to liberal education, we're grasping in this contrast, or having reconstructed Locke's argument, shown Rousseau's critique, how would Locke respond?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I do think I'll take a look at the conclusion, but I just noted that I'm hearing the same thing, that it really does seem like we're coming out in favor of Rousseau, even if we're not trying to do that for a series of reasons. And I really like the idea of opening up a dialogue or exposing the tension in liberal educational models. To respond to that specific question, yeah, we just got thumped on that a little bit at the APSA panel. There was a lot of resistance to using Locke and his educational model as something to evaluate for contemporary models of liberal education. And a lot of Locke isn't a liberal and this kind of thing we see now in some of our hedging in the paper on that point. So yeah, I think we need to think through a little bit how we might reframe that, hopefully to recapture some of the bigger questions. Because I mean, that's what we went to was, right, we have something to say about, just say civic instead of liberal. Yeah. Maybe we will just do that. Yeah, I think it is really getting at the tension or difficulty with achieving something like both rational consent, or citizens who have independent thought. Maybe we don't want to go as far as autonomy, and are capable of self-government, and the kinds of limitations in one approach to how you foster that, without suggesting that the thing that you should do is just abandon liberal educational models altogether, or try to educate someone a la Emil's education, or educate a child a la Emil's education. So thanks.
Michael.
Yeah, Michelle, I think just one issue that hasn't come up is authority. I think both Locke and Rousseau think that we need authority in our lives, and there are and we have to learn how to recognize authority and to distinguish it from despotism. And children have to learn that they can't choose to have authority or not. They have to learn that. And some of you have heard this before, but my son, when he was 10 or so, came in and said to me one day, Dad, you run this house like a fascist. And I said, you will not demean the victims of fascism. Go look that up. And he came back about half an hour and said, Dad, you run this house like an authoritarian. And I said, yes, that's exactly right. We should be. You need an authority. You need somebody to teach you, what's in your own self-interest, because you don't understand that. So I think that's it would be a mistake. And I think Rousseau tends to see Locke more as somebody who is an overweening authority, who's teaching parents to be overweening authorities. And I just think that's I like your idea of coming back to defend Rousseau, to defend Locke against Rousseau, although maybe with Jeff's, the dialogue, I think would also be a good way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw Rita's hand go up. I think her book is a really great exploration of this point, the fact that you need a certain kind of authority and obedience to authority in early education for liberal citizenship to work, and has great chapters on, at least the version that I saw of it had great chapters on Locke and Rousseau. I just think that yeah, I guess I mean, I think that I lean more, and Tim and I both have to talk about this, but I lean more toward Jeff's suggestion of opening up a dialogue or perhaps a tension in this, rather than saying that Locke is, you know, right on how we should conceive of authority and its proper relationship to, or the use of authority in raising children who will be, you know, again, capable of independent thought, capable of consent, then saying Rousseau's model is correct or his is correct, right? And authority for Rousseau is obviously, there are all authority figures in Rousseau's thought are, but like, you know, classically problematic, sort of impossible figures, the roles they play, whether it's the tutor or the lawgiver or whomever. So yeah, so I think we definitely need to talk about authority, I think, a little bit more than we do. And maybe if we can do that by still reframing it in the way that Jeff suggested.
Rita.
Yeah, I mean, I would say don't talk about authority, contra Michael. I mean, the problem that Rousseau has with Locke's view of authority is not that it's authority, but that you can't consent to it at the age that the Lockean child does, right? And I think Jonathan Marks talks about this. So in some sense, that's already territory that's covered, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is that like the whole Lockean regime is based on consent, but you're imposing authority on infants who plainly cannot consent. And that's why Rousseau has an alternative in which Emile only consents to the tutor at like the age of 16, right? And that's when he like falls to his knees and says like, oh, I've seen all the good things you've done for me. And I thank you so much. Please lead me forward. I can't do anything for myself, right? But like to get Emile to that point is impossible. I mean, it's possible only in the telling of this book, right? But in real life, you could never raise a child that way, right? To hold off on, I mean, that's what the tutor does. Everything is orchestrated so that Rousseau never feels that anybody is ever imposing a will on him, right? So, I mean, to go back to Michael Hawley's point, right? You can't do that in society, right? It's just totally impossible. And that seems to be part of what Rousseau is trying to show, right? That if you have to work out Locke's logic, you can't educate a child. So, I mean, and that's why I think like you don't need to get into the authority question, because in a way that critique, that's what Jonathan Marks has already sort of laid out, right? That the problem that Rousseau sees with Locke is that there's this consent that occurs when it couldn't possibly occur by Lockean standards. And if you really wanted a consent, you would have to do it the way that Rousseau is showing you how to do it, which is then impossible. So, I mean, in a way it goes back to Jeff's point, right? Which is also what I was trying to push you towards, which is why is Rousseau making this critique, right? He's showing that all of these things are philosophically contradictory, but Locke is the one that's practical. You can do a Lockean education. It's not like that far from what we do, actually, right? Now we don't do the beatings anymore, or we say we don't. I don't know. Maybe respectable people don't do the
tossing them into cold water in the morning.
Yeah. I mean, my kids go to forest school where they're like literally in cold water all day. And this is, everybody finds this very commendable and progressive. So, I mean, it's not that far from the reality that we are still in. And so I think that that's the real question, is in some sense, Locke's answer to Rousseau's critique is fine, but this is imaginary. And what I'm suggesting is real and it's doable.
Yeah, I guess the thing that as is probably evidenced by a lot of my hedging on this stuff, or the saying that, you know, I just flat out don't quite understand how to evaluate some of the models that Rousseau gives us in Emile, is I am not quite sure he is just presenting Emile as the educational model that he wants, and that one as preferable to all of the kinds of examples of education or instances of instruction that he gives to already civilized or already corrupted children, right? In other words, is there, I think there might also be some kind of practical education in Emile, but I don't know. Yeah.
Sophie
Huh?
has practical education.
Oh, yeah, definitely Sophie. But even, I mean, again, these other pupils that are not Emile. So, yeah, in any event, I don't think that that necessarily, matters for what you're saying. Yeah, I'll stop there.
We have 3 minutes left. Aline, can it be a less than
I'd
1
be-
minute
I'd be
question?
very,
Less than
very-
1 minute. Okay.
Yeah, I know. I have been reprimanded before I got it. Just one thing, like I'm still going back. I don't really care about what Rousseau thought about education or Locke thought about education. In this particular case of the paper, I think what you still have to clarify is what hypocrisy means in terms of human nature. What is the human nature? Because I was thinking about, like, and this is the last point, persona. We are persons, right? Persona means a mask. So I'm pretending to be something else, and yet throughout the Middle Ages, persona came to signify that I'm showing my true face. So once again, I think everything boils down to what is the difference between appearance and reality when we think about the self, which, to brag a little bit about it, the form, internum, form, externum, I published quite a bit about that, which was the main understanding throughout the Middle Ages for centuries, and we kind of forgot that completely. And I'm stopping here. It was just a suggestion.
Thanks, Aline.
Great. Okay. Well, we are done. We'll be back next month. First Friday of what is the next month? April. Okay. Thanks so much, Michelle. That was great. Best of luck to you with the paper. And see you all next time.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for the great comments and participation.